Thank you for attending our panel. We're very excited to be here. My name is Jane McQuillen. I am a graduate of the executive program at the business school, and it is indeed a pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you for your attention in choosing our panel versus some of the other ones that were also very interesting at this time. I am going to serve as your moderator for our panel entitled today, going from socially responsible investing to sustainability. With regard to my background, I have 15 years in the sustainable investment space. I am a portfolio manager and the head of our environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, investment program at ClearBridge Advisors, which is the largest equity affiliate of Legg Mason, which is a global asset manager. We have a terrific lineup of speakers with us today, and their bios and affiliations are very impressive, but they are in your handout, so I'm not going to take a lot of time to go through their bios. And I'd like to let you know the format that we've had planned for today is to really try to make this interactive. We don't really want to be speaking to you the entire time. Each of the speakers are going to be permitted some short introductory comments, but then we would like to go ahead and get the discussion started. And we very much look forward to your questions for this panel. So if I may quickly introduce the panelists going to from my left, we have Vinay Nair, who is the founder of Ada Investments, and he is an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School. So his full-time role is with his investment company, and his part-time role is as a professor. Next to him is Peter Knight, and he is president of Generation Investment Management. Many of you may have heard of the firm and some of the famous affiliations with Generation. Then next to him is Bryan Corbett, and Bryan is a principal in Global Government and Regulatory Affairs for the Carlyle Group. And next to him is, last but not least, is Valerie Cook Smith, who is the Vice President of Corporate Sustainability for Citigroup. So before I begin my remarks, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to Pepe and to Emily for their very hard work on behalf of our panel. They spent some of the summer actually trying to organize this, and they want to find the best speakers in their sector who are leaders in the sustainability space. So thank you very much, Pepe and Emily, for your time. The topic of the panel actually today is very interesting, and it's timely. As the world, including the United States, has begun to further acknowledge the importance and significance of environmental and social externalities such as carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, water scarcity, poverty, and so on and so forth, and that the world is actually starting to integrate these factors in their public policy making, as well as the financial research, as well as equity investment selection, lending practices, equity projects that they select. So it's really being factored across, not just globally or geographically, but also across different sectors. Sustainability criteria have made their way into the mainstream, or at least a larger portion of our attention is now being paid attention to these issues. Let's take a show of hands, if you don't mind, from the audience so that we can direct some of our comments to get a sense of who's in the room. If anyone is familiar with the term socially responsible investing, or SRI, could you raise your hand? Oh, okay, great, thanks. If anyone's not familiar. Could we also get a sense of how many in the room work in the corporate sector, some sort of company or corporation? Okay, so a fair number. And how many work in investment field, some sort of investment-related field? And anyone who's with, say, community or relations or nonprofits, NGOs? Oh, so it's almost like a third, a third, a third? That's right, good breakout. Just out of curiosity, we'd also like to know, since this is an investment-related panel as well, do any of you have the perception that socially responsible investing or sustainable investing cannot perform as well as traditional investments, that you do have to give up anything? Okay, good, thank you. Thank you for showing your hand. And then, does anyone in the room believe or have a feeling or a thinking or inkling toward that sustainability factors could actually potentially enhance long-term performance and perhaps help to mitigate or divert oneself from a certain type of risk? Okay, so that's a fair number in the room. Thank you. we on the panel, when we were discussing with Pepe and Emily, I almost said Brangelina, I did Pepe and Pepelina, Pepe and Emily, sorry. We were on the panel, we were speaking in preparation, and one of the observations we had is that from our past discussions and conferences that the terminology has kind of been a bit of a boondoggle for some of the audience members, in the sense that probably by now, if you've heard of the term socially responsible investing, you've probably started to hear other terms like sustainable investing or ESG investing or mission-related investing, responsible investing. Each of these have their kind of own groups of professionals who associate themselves with those terms. So mission-related investing, you typically hear of foundations or faith-based being using that approach. Responsible investing is often with investment consultants. ESG or sustainable investing is often with asset managers and perhaps private equity and small cap and other asset allocation investors. So each of these have their place. What we'd like to do is, in our comments, is to address this briefly or in your questions. But without, getting too caught up in a name, I think one of the questions we ask ourselves is, what are the differences in the outcomes? So not to just think about the names, but what is the impact, whether it's financial or social or both? So without further ado, with the comments, let's begin with the comments from our speakers, who have a variety of experiences, who have different perspectives, and who do lots of activities in the sustainable investment space. And I'd like to go ahead and ask Professor Nair to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Jane. So good morning, everyone. As Mary Jane mentioned, I run a small fund along with a few partners who are actually here. And the fund manages a traditional and 2 hedged funds in the US and a few funds in India as well. What we do is integrate environmental, social, governance information along with the financial economic aspects to pick stocks, simply put. So we have some strong convictions about the fact that this information enhances returns. We really view this as an option. We think that environmental, social, governance information affects company value, and it's not really reflected correctly in public prices, so we integrate it to enhance returns. So it's a very return-oriented approach to ESG, which we call sustainability broadly. I also teach part-time. I'm a recovering academic. I used to teach full-time at the Wharton School, and now I teach part-time at Columbia, and that's really how I spend the time. In terms of, Mary Jane wanted me to touch upon performance because that was one of the questions that came upon early. In terms of performance, as I mentioned, we do think this enhances returns. Now, like most things, it depends on how you integrate it. I don't think there's a blanket statement that it enhances returns, and which is part of the reason the panel title was from SRI to sustainability. A lot of the early stage SRI, which is ethics-based or values-based or more expressionistic, where you would remove, say, nicotine or alcohol or any such sector which you feel against, I'm not sure how it affects performance, to be honest. I think that in some periods it looks better, in some other periods it looks worse because it changes a lot of the portfolio characteristics. But if integrated correctly, and Peter could shed more light on that too, we do believe it improves performance. And to prove that out, when we started the fund 2 years back, in September 2008, great timing, we basically launched 2 funds in parallel, one with all the sustainability factors integrated and one without the sustainability factors but the same financial variables. So we had a perfect control experiment set up 2 years back. 2 years hence, the performance of the sustainability fund does look better than the non-sustainable fund. So this is real money, real returns, audited. And thanks to some incidents like BP, Massey, Toyota, I think the outperformance has been particularly exaggerated this year.
Great. Thank you. Perfect sort of segue. I'm Peter Knight with Generation Investment Management, and we do have some luminaries in our fund. Our chairman is the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, and our senior partner is the former head of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, David Blood. So we are sometimes affectionately called the Blood and Gore Fund, which probably particularly apt here in Halloween time as we're getting in, and we could a pretty good name for hedge fund too, I think, yeah. Actually, this is my third trip to the campus this week, and just parenthetically, there was an unbelievable conference. I hope some of you may have attended on sovereign wealth funds that Professor Joe Stiglitz put on. I guess it wasn't the business school, but I know an awful lot in the business school were there, where about, there were different estimates, but about $6.5 trillion was represented from the various sovereign wealth funds around the world. And the topic was sustainable capitalism. So many of the issues that we're here talking with and how they should grapple with them. And George Soros was there, and Vice President Gore delivered a speech. Of course, he had 40 minutes to talk about sustainable investing, and I only have 5, and yes. Mary Jane's going to give me the hook in a second. But we're very passionate about what we do, which is in the public equity arena. We have pioneered, if you will, or started the area of sustainable investing in the public equity space. We're in global equities, meaning that we invest all over in mid and large cap companies. We use a concentrated approach, so we're attempting to beat the market. And we would argue that sustainability is not only a good way to invest, but it is a much better way to invest. In fact, we would argue that it is the best way to invest on a long-term, long-only basis. So perhaps I should, at the very beginning, talk about what we mean by sustainable investing. And Professor Nair had mentioned it a little bit, but basically what we think of sustainable investing is the explicit recognition in the investment process that environmental, social, governance, geopolitical, ethical factors matter to business, they drive revenues, and importantly, they drive competitive positioning. If you're looking at companies, you need to understand how they're going to position themselves competitively. If you want to understand all the opportunities that these companies have, their risks, you have to do a fulsome examination of for all of the ESG factors that are out there. The principles that we live by in the sustainable investing world, which I'll just go through quickly, is that we are long-term in our approach, and I think sustainability needs to also be thought of in context with a long-term approach. As all of you have more recently taken Finance 101, understand that, and in fact, Columbia helped to give birth to the long-term investment trend with Graham and Dodd, and of course Mr. Buffett and others. We think that's the best way to invest, and it's from Finance 101. If 60 to 80% of the value of the company is built up in its cash flow over the long term, then it's pretty critical that you understand those long-term factors and those long-term success factors, in addition to the fact that they've got to execute on the short term. So what we do at Generation is understand not just the short-term drivers, which kind of, in one sense, drive us crazy. The short-termism, the focus on quarter-to-quarter earnings, drive us crazy, and in a sense, we're kind of arbitraging that. But that we feel that you have to integrate those long-term success factors into your investment process, so that you have to do both. You have to have a fundamental, bottoms-up understanding of what that company is doing while integrated with that long-term approach. And we do that in the investment team by giving our investment analysts a very wide berth to go after and to look at these companies. It usually takes us 3 or 4 months to understand a company fully before it is looked to come forward for our examination and what we call our focus list. So it's the true integration. At the end of the day, what sustainability does for us is a very powerful lens into the quality of the business and the quality of the management team. And it is all about, and why I say it's the best way to invest, it's all about increasing conviction. The more you know, the better investor you're going to be. And we think that a fulsome analysis requires you to look at all of those factors in a very deep way and to understand them. And so sustainable investing to us, in short, is the search for high-quality management teams, high-quality businesses that use sustainability as a competitive advantage.
Great. First, I have to say, this is a very intimidating setup. I feel like all of this, hopefully you'll take it easy on this. My name is Bryan Corbett. I'm with the Carlyle Group. We're a global private equity firm. We have about $90 billion under management. Our bread and butter business is making investments, controlling investments in company that we will own and control for 3 to 5 years before we then exit the investment. We also have a large real estate and credit platform as well. What I'd like to do in my short time is just give you an overview of how Carlyle and the private equity industry is beginning to think about ESG issues. I imagine there's some skepticism in the audience in terms of what is the private equity industry doing? Is it really committed to ESG? And hopefully during our conversation in the next hour, you'll have a better sense of what we're doing. In the late, I'd say 2008, 2007, we began to hear a lot from our investors, our limited partners who give us their capital and trust us to make investments. We began to hear from them about ESG concerns. They wanted to see a greater commitment from Carlyle to ESG, and we really took that seriously. So we began to explore how we could better incorporate ESG into our investment process. We talked to folks at the UNPRI, and we talked to some large institutional investors, and we realized that we needed to come up with a set of principles that could help guide our process. So in late 2008, Carlyle came up with some principles that enunciate 9 or 10 different elements that we will look at when we go to buy a company. We have incorporated those principles into our investment process so that before we make a controlling investment, the investment memo that goes to our chief investment officer must include an analysis of ESG issues. Our thinking around the principles sort of served as a standard for the rest of the private equity industry, and the industry's trade group, which is called the Private Equity Council, in early 2009 adopted a similar set of principles that were close to what we came up with at Carlyle. So now you have 10 to 12 of the largest U.S. private equity firms now applying these principles to their investments. So the implementation of the principles has been important to us, and I think we've done a good job of getting it into our investment process. The second element is once we've done that, what do we do with the companies once we own them? So socializing those principles with our portfolio companies is the next element of our process, and we're right in the middle of that now. And as you can imagine, when you own 50, 60 companies, there's a lot of variation among management teams and companies in different sectors, everything from telecom to consumer products to industrial. So we're working now with our CEOs and the boards of those companies to implement the principles into their day-to-day governance processes, and that's an ongoing process. The other element of our ESG platform has been to reach out to the Environmental Defense Fund and to form a partnership with EDF. EDF worked with us to develop a new due diligence tool that we refer to as the Eco Value Screen. And Eco Value Screen is a framework that we are applying to investments in the US and in Europe that approaches particularly environmental issues from an environmental enhancement perspective rather than from a risk mitigation perspective. Traditionally, buyout firms, when they made investments, they looked and really analyzed the environmental risks around an investment. But we're trying to flip that and look at environmental opportunities that will lead to enhanced financial performance and creating some metrics by which we can measure the improved financial performance by changing the operations of a company around its environmental footprint. We are looking at a couple of deals right now where we will for the first time apply the Eco Value Screen. We announced it in March. As Peter alluded to, and Vinay, the economy hasn't been all that great the last couple of years, so deal flow is starting to pick up again, and we will have some real opportunities to apply this. So we're very excited about this. I look forward to answering your questions and talking more about how we're doing this, but I think that at least sets the table for our discussion.
Hi, everybody. I'm Val Smith with Citi's Corporate Sustainability Unit, and our unit works across Citigroup's different businesses to develop and help implement environmental and human rights initiatives. So we work in partnership with different units inside our different business groups to actually implement a wide variety of environmental policies and strategies. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about sort of the debt side of the financing piece. And I think if you look at the environmental coin for a company like Citigroup, there's a risk part of that coin and there's the opportunity side of that coin. And I'll talk first about how we have worked to address the risk side of that coin and in fact turned it into an opportunity as well. For banks like Citigroup, when you're competing with other banks to provide debt financing to clients, we have to be careful not to sort of put ourselves out there in a position where the client's going to turn to another bank. So what we have strived to do is to develop industry transforming policies and principles that have really moved the way that the industry addresses environmental and social risk issues. In 2003, Citigroup partnered with 3 European banks to develop the Equator Principles, which were really the first set of principles that transformed the way that the banking industry looks at environmental and social risk. The Equator Principles were looking at environmental and social risk specifically associated with project finance transactions. And those principles have now been adopted by about 67 financial institutions around the world. So what it has done is has made, first of all, it has made an even playing field for banks seeking to finance these types of transactions and has sort of lifted the playing field for everyone. Following the Equator Principle for project finance, we also developed a broader environmental and social risk management policy that covers a broader variety of transactions, again, where we know how the financing is going to be used, whether it's for a project or a set of projects. Where we know how the proceeds of our financing will be used, we implement this policy. And last year, we evaluated about 387 transactions against this policy prior to proceeding with funding of some of them. We also have developed the carbon principles, again, with some partner banks in the United States, also with partners from the NGO sector and with client partners. Carbon principles were really designed to address U.S. power plant financing in the United States to look at the carbon risks in a pre-regulatory environment and determine how we can work with our clients to sort of get ahead of some of those risks. More recently, a year ago, we finalized a special environmental diligence process focused on the issue of mountaintop removal coal mining. This was an issue that, while several others in our industry have developed other approaches, this is one we sort of took on our own. We saw this as not a big global issue like some of the other ones we've dealt with, but as a very important issue in the United States and a very important issue regionally. We now have a robust set of about 33 different environmental diligence questions that we engage with clients on before deciding whether to go forward with a transaction with them. So a lot of people ask us, is this about Citigroup doing less business? And there have been instances where, for a variety of reasons, it's not usually just environmental and social, there are usually other reasons as well, that we have decided not to go forward with a financing transaction. Our goal is to work with clients to really move the needle on best practice and performance. And that's our goal, that's our competitors' goal with these policies, those who have adopted them. And we believe that having real expertise on this environmental and social risk side, if we're the best bank at helping clients to meet these principles, then that turns this risk into an opportunity for us. Because we can go to clients and say, look, a lot of banks are going to be coming to you and saying this needs to be an Equator Principles compliant transaction. We have a lot of expertise in helping clients to achieve that. So that's one side of the opportunity piece. And the other side, which I won't get into, but I just wanted to mention briefly, is sort of a financing the future side. So, as banks have gotten more and more comfortable looking at environmental and social risks and how do we become the best at addressing those risks with our clients, there's still the piece of wanting to do more and more of the sort of environmental opportunity piece, financing renewable energy, financing alternative energy, financing clean tech, and Citi has set up a number of initiatives so that we can be the best at that too. We have a $50 billion climate initiative, which is really around financing and investing in 10 years, $50 billion of climate positive activity. It's sort of an accounting exercise, but what it really did is sent a very strong signal internally to our bankers and externally to our clients that this is an area that we intend to grow our business in. We now have a global alternative energy group of bankers around the world that meet by conference call twice a week to talk about transactions and look for sort of synergies across our different regions. And we have a number of firsts accomplished by that group. The most recently was a really neat wind transaction in California by Terragen. And it accomplished a number of firsts. It was the largest wind financing ever done in the United States. It was the first sale-leaseback structure for financing wind, which means that Citigroup actually owns the wind project and leases it back to the client. It was a $1.2 billion transaction. It's going to power about 150 households in California. So I think for Citigroup, how we approach socially responsible investing has really been achieving excellence on the managing ESG risks and helping our clients to achieve excellence in that area, and then also working to achieve excellence in being more innovative and sort of more thoughtful in how we finance all of the climate positive activities that are emerging.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everyone for their introductory remarks. We'd like to actually turn it back to you right now, and throughout the discussion, please feel free to raise your hand, and if a question comes to mind or something starts to ruminate to the top. If you don't mind, I'll start from the left to right. Is that Sophie?
Sophie Roman, I work with Planet Finance. Oh, thank you. Hi, I work with Planet Finance and microfinance institutions. I have two questions. The first one is for Bryan. Private equity is by definition private equity. So what do you communicate to your LPs in terms of ESG investing? What type of criteria do you communicate with them? Because your portfolio companies probably don't want you to publicize what they're doing to the outside world. And the second question was for Peter. How long is long term?
Your question's short. That's actually it's slightly more complicated. Long-term, depending on what industry you're talking about, long-term in the technology industry is pretty short. Long-term in the industrial space is quite long. We actually do one thing to help to promote our clients and our investors to think long-term by instituting a mechanism that allows us to cover our costs with a management fee, but then have a performance fee that is only paid after 3 years, and then only to the extent we exceed our benchmark. So we try to align ourselves directly with clients on a 3-year basis. We actually wanted to push that out to 5 years, but we didn't think that the marketplace would allow us to, and that's probably right. It's a very different way of thinking about it. It's not alien to the private equity world or the hedge fund or venture, but in the public equity space, it's really quite different. So I guess that our modeling, if you say from what we do in our research, we put out our modeling 40 years.
Bryan, do you mind, Professor, also?
No. I'm just going to add to that. I think one of the long-term when it comes to profitability is different from long-term when it comes to valuation. I think all that really matters is that the markets see the future profitability being impacted by sustainability. Now, that could happen immediately if there's an accident like BP, and then everyone starts looking at every other company's long-term safety record. And that gets priced in, and you can benefit from that. So I think that the long-term question could be tomorrow if it's priced tomorrow, or could be in 1 year if it's priced in 1 year, which is something which I think there's a huge disconnect between how people think in terms of profits and how people think in terms of valuation.
Your question to me is a good one because it's about accountability and how will we be measured and what kind of reporting we do. So right now, our last 2 annual reports to our LPs have included a section that discusses our corporate citizenship initiatives, talks about developing and implementing the principles. So that goes to all of our LPs, and it's also publicly available. We also do a lot of one-off calls with LPs. European investors have been much more aggressive in approaching us about ESG. So the preponderance of our conversations have been with European investors. We're starting to see more from US, but we will pick up the phone and talk to people and walk them through what we're doing. We are thinking about how to build a more robust annual reporting mechanism, so that's something that we're thinking about, and a number of our LPs would like to see that. With respect to the individual portfolio companies, you're right in the sense that the companies don't really want us talking publicly about their operations, but what we're finding is that on ESG-related matters, our companies are very proud of what they're doing, and they want to talk about their good record. They see an opportunity from a business perspective to get out in front of the oncoming sort of corporate citizenship initiatives that are coming their way, whether it's Congress, whether it's the regulator. We're moving towards a more environmentally friendly world, and our CEOs at our companies recognize that, and they see an opportunity to create a niche for themselves. We, as I tried to articulate early on, we see the ESG issues as really good business practice, and the two can coexist together, and in fact, we think the environment can enhance the performance of a lot of our companies.
Any other questions? The young lady in the front. Could you please wait for the mic?
Hi, thank you for coming here today. I'm a student here at Columbia, but just before coming here, I was working with a private equity fund in Kenya that gave serious consideration to ESG issues as well as development impact. And so I wanted to ask you, I believe that all of your organizations invest both domestically and abroad. So what do you see as the global trends in sustainability investing? And how would you compare both the investors and the portfolio companies across probably US, Europe, and particular emerging markets?
We invest globally, and we actually do not have any investments in Africa right this minute, perhaps because of market cap and liquidity issues, and we're mostly in the mid and large cap, and there aren't quite as many opportunities there. But we do invest in emerging markets in Brazil and Mexico and China and India, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we do, we grappled with the issue, and I don't know if you're exactly going there, was whether you change your metrics for management quality and business quality depending on where you're investing. And it was particularly a concern for us in China. And all of those, China is a conundrum in many ways, and we actually had a company that we did, I mean, literally 3 months of due diligence. We knew the company extremely well. We thought it had, it had the right management. The quality of the business was very strong, and so we invested. We stuck our foot in their toe in the water, if you will. About a month after we invested, the government arrested the CEO. The fund was selling of the company was frozen, so that we couldn't buy, we couldn't get out, the liquidity was damaged. And it was all because of something that he had done 20 years ago. It had nothing to do with this current company. So you could do all the possible work that you think you could do, and so you confront those and you get very nervous about the transparency, the disclosure, corporate governance issues. But it did force us to come to grips with the fact of, okay, how do we look at China? How do we look at India? How do we look at some others that may not be as on the maturity curve of corporate governance, may not have had Sarbanes-Oxley and so forth. And basically came to the conclusion after a lot of wrangling that we would not diminish our assessment of management quality, that would keep the same standards throughout the entire world. And we hope that's the right choice. But what it does mean is we don't have as many opportunities in China right now. However, in 5 years, we're quite certain we will.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just follow, because we also work in public equities. One of the things we notice is we invest globally as well, but most of our investments are U.S.-based companies. But increasingly, our U.S.-based companies are finding that their revenue growth is coming from outside the U.S. and including emerging markets and not just Europe. And I think part of your question was about the trends that we're seeing with some of these companies. And rather than, we talk a lot about the risk side, we want, a lot of our companies or our investments are thinking about the risk related to ESG. But another trend that, and frankly, one of the funny questions I get asked a lot is when is this trend of sustainability going to end? And it's like, well, it would be nice if we didn't have to think about it, but the trend is probably not going to go away, unfortunately, because we do have to address these issues. So, but if we're going to use the word trend, what we're seeing with our companies is that rather than just focusing on the risks, we're saying where can we find the solutions to the problems or the issues that society is facing? How can we be the front leader to come up with the water technology or to come up with the renewable energy technology? And so a lot of our investments are reflected through mid to large cap companies as well that focus on the solutions as opposed to business as usual and avoiding risks.
Getting back to Peter's comment on China, I think what we're seeing is that some of the emerging markets actually present some of the greatest opportunity to integrate ESG thinking into your investment because in those countries, their processes aren't as sophisticated as in the US and Europe, and they're not as developed. So to give you an example, about a year ago, we invested in an infant food formula company in China. And about a year before our investment, they had a major outbreak of, outbreak's not the right word, but they had found a lot of contaminated baby food from melamine, and thousands of infants died. So before we made that investment, we were obviously very concerned about that potential risk and how would the government react, and was it a sector we should just stay away from? But instead, we thought, well, actually, here's an opportunity to improve the food quality processes to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So we made the investment, but we also brought in a new chief quality officer. We created a food safety committee that's headed by a former FDA official. So we were trying to bring some of the experience from the U.S. to China to improve their processes and their thinking around social issues.
I'll wrap that up and say, at first with your question, I thought, well, we don't really treat them any differently. But then I thought back historically to how some of these policies actually came to be. And I will say Citigroup has, I think, over half of our business is outside the United States, and we have a very large emerging market footprint. I mean, we believe that's where the growth is, and we've made strategic decisions to make sure that we're poised to help finance that growth. The Equator Principles were really developed with the idea of projects that were being developed in emerging markets in mind. And in fact, for OECD countries, the Equator Principles and our environmental and social risk management policy overall, in OECD countries, compliance with local laws is considered to be adequate for meeting those principles. Now, two things. We have since developed policies specifically targeted at U.S. practices because there are areas where our regulatory environment is not yet where we believe it needs to be to address certain risks, and that's the carbon principles, that's the mountaintop removal coal mining diligence. But also on the emerging market side, this is where there's a lot of room for sort of raising that playing field and moving the needle on some of these issues. And yes, there may be in certain instances issues where the ESG performance needs to be brought to a certain place before the financing can move forward. But there's also, I think, in many instances, a great appetite to do that. Both to meet the international financing requirements, but also because there's an interest in meeting best practices. So, for us, that's where a real opportunity lies, is working with these clients to get to that point of best practice so that, they can get the financing from the international institutions.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir? We're going to go this way, if that's okay.
Hi, my name is Dan Jafrida. I'm with the Columbia University Sustainability Management Program. And in the sustainable investment space, so much of the opportunities are being driven by government legislation. I was just wondering how you are all thinking about policy uncertainty and political risk with many of your investments.
Well, I think it's a great question, and very timely as to the failure of the United States Senate to take up climate change legislation. There certainly are things that we watch out for and pay very, very close attention to, but it's also things that we don't have actually any control over. What could be done, the most important thing that could possibly be done and it is going to be done over the next 10 years, is put a price on carbon to create the kind of certainty that corporations need to go forward and make the kind of investments, and then the certainty also from the investor side. That will happen, and governments do need to lead the way. Many governments are leading the way, but it's just not the United States government. The SEC is doing some interesting things on disclosure. They have some rules and regulations coming out on transparency of ESG factors. I think, there are also some elements of people looking at ERISA that are labor funds and other pension funds, changing the definition of fiduciary responsibility to actually allow, if not require, them to look at things like ESG factors in their examination. So there are obviously an awful lot of things that the government can do. We, in our modeling, do not put that into the consideration and don't bet on government regulation. I think it's a failed bet. Spend a fair amount of time in Washington and know that is kind of a failed bet. But it is certainly something that you have to. The role of government is going to be enhanced over the next 10 to 20 years, just because of the nature of the things that have happened. Look at BP, look at the financial crisis. And governments enter into these markets and do so in a sort of gross, crude way. I mean, I don't know how the financial reform legislation will work its way out, but sometimes, very often, there's an overreaction and there's a pendulum that goes back and forth. But it's something that you have to live with as an investor. And we're bottom-up fundamental stock pickers, not macro analysts, but you certainly have to be more macro. And certainly the companies have to be very cognizant of that. And that's why ESG is so important, because they have to understand those risks. And basically most of the more enlightened corporations have also, especially in respect to carbon, have priced that into their thinking and see it as a big opportunity. And if it isn't, it's a huge risk for them.
In terms of, I think my view on regulation broadly is that it should allow market forces to develop correctly rather than override market forces. Now, there are two big failures which we've learned from. One is information, and I think part of the transparency moves that SEC is doing and could do will solve that problem, at least partially, and I think that's definitely a favorable initiative in terms of regulation, which is getting more transparency and information. And the second is really externalities, where corporations do things sometimes which is not really priced into their securities. And most of the regulation that tries to address that will also help much of the sustainability investment theme over a broader, bigger, longer trend, especially as the government gets more involved in financing and GDP growth. So I actually think both of these broader market failures should be fixed at the periphery rather than try and solve the problem at the center. And currently, nothing is being done. That's part of the government's task. And I think that I'm very optimistic about how regulation worldwide would develop in terms of how sustainability would be a profitable investment strategy or not.
Did you want to say anything? Otherwise, we'll take the next question.
Well, we can go forward with more questions.
We have a lot of questions I can see, so if you don't mind, we'll just keep moving, and then we could always come back if we have extra time. The gentleman with the white shirt, if you could please wait for the microphone.
Good morning. I'm actually just returning from the SOCAP conference, and one of the most interesting conversations offline there was the difference between social responsible investing and impact investing. So I'd like to hear from a private equity fund as well as Citi and other folks how you see the difference between investing in companies that are doing well for the community and actually investing in opportunities that are actually making the community better and really impact investing versus socially responsible investing, taking that to the next level and seeing your firm's views and your personal views on that.
Sure. I'm not sure that we draw as fine a distinction as you're implying. I think our perspective is being a good corporate citizen and taking into account social and environmental and labor factors into our investment decisions is good business practice. So they are very similar. As I said before, historically, I think a lot of investors looked at environmental risks from a defensive posture. We are trying to flip that to be more proactive and thinking about how companies in which we make an investment can change their practices to improve their performance. But at least from our perspective, we don't get into whether it's viewed this way or that way. I think we just see it, whatever we can do to improve the operation of our companies and to enhance our investment decisions by factoring in these ESG issues is a good thing. And we're not as caught up in labels.
We spend a lot of time in the area of impact investing, not necessarily on our investment team, but others and I think it's one of the most interesting developments, nascent as it is, and perhaps most important. And a speech actually that happened to be at our conference, Judith Rodin from the Rockefeller Foundation basically was talking about the fact that Rockefeller Foundation had started philanthropy for the first 100 years, but the next 100 years is going to be how to develop philanthropy in a different way. And she highlighted impact investing as a way to do that, and basically said that in the world there are 12 trillion, and she estimated how that she came to that $12 trillion worth of problems, but the philanthropic world is really about 500 billion. So you're not going to get to scale. You're not going to be able to solve those kinds of problems unless you come up with new mechanisms to try to do that. And so you're moving from philanthropy up or over, I don't know if it would be up or over, the professor would tell us, on the capital structure. And impact investing, as you know, has different aspects to it. It has a financial first and a social impact first. And there's a continuum on there. And you could, as long as you're returning, and it's a sustainable investment, that is, you're returning some capital to it. Some investors will say, okay, I'm fine with only getting 10%, whereas I should be getting 15%, but I'll get 5% in a social return. And metrics are now being developed, which is really an interesting, very interesting development. And I think, microfinance is a beautiful example of what happened. It started as philanthropy and moved its way up the capital structure to solve the problems of the world. That's precisely what we need to do. We have a second strategy we call the Climate Solutions Fund, which although it's a market rate, absolute market rate return, people think of it as a impact investment in that sense, because our gating issue is it has to be a solution to the climate crisis. So there are the definitional issues on impact investing, but I think it's actually one of the most important things. And what we all need to do is to move up that capital structure, to move it into mainstream, because that's what we would argue is a more sustainable form of capitalism. The more you can move up that capital structure.
I can just speak really quickly to it, which is we also don't really differentiate between the two. I will note that Citi Foundation, which is separate from the company and separate from my unit, has a laser-like focus on impact investments. They focus on economic empowerment of communities around the world, and it's very impact-driven and results-oriented and returns-oriented, not necessarily financial returns. But I thought, the microfinance instance is a perfect example. Bob Benevole, many of you heard speak earlier today, and he's in the room, is the head of our global microfinance business. Citigroup Foundation has a long-standing relationship with microfinance institutions from the philanthropic side, a very different type of investments. All of the activities that I've been discussing, however, are very business-oriented. There's no lens that we look at where we say, oh, is this the right thing to do? Is this socially responsible investing? It's all very business-oriented. We happen to believe that there's no differentiation between, socially responsible investing and investing that makes good business sense.
Okay. I'm gonna come back again, but if the young lady next to you. Okay.
Hi, my name is Catherine Bierce, and I graduated from college this June and currently volunteering at the Acumen Fund and looking at careers in New York and social impact. The question is, at what point do you think SRI will become mainstream to the point where you have funds like what you're doing with the Vanguard or Fortress, a kind of level of mainstream size?
I'll just say a couple of comments. Thank you for that question. I was actually going to use that as a question to ask the panel if we had a pause in questions, and we haven't. So I think one of the questions I was going to ask is if we're in a room of intelligent people who all mean well but also want to have sustainable investments, why wouldn't the whole market recognize this, and why wouldn't everyone be doing sustainable investing? Why wouldn't everyone look at ESG factors? Why does it seem like there's still a relatively, compared to the global funds and investments, still a relatively small number of players involved in this? And one, some of the questions I've asked myself about this is it people don't have the patience, they don't want to wait for the results orientation of some of these activities related to carbon or related to water scarcity. Some of these have longer time frames and perhaps they don't want to wait. Is it a misperception of what ESG actually means, so there's a misunderstanding of how to execute and how to implement it? Or is it a personal knee-jerk reaction that this is something that does not add value and thus you have that hurdle? These are all issues that we ask ourselves in the industry as to why this is not all mainstream. It's going mainstream. It's made huge strides. Look at the panelists on this in this topic, but it still has a way to go.
So the way I see it develop is really three broad areas. I think one would be, as we've discussed, a substitute to philanthropy to a large extent, which is what impact investing broadly becomes. Because if you have 500 billion and you have 10 trillion of problems, and if someone is willing to take 5% lesser return than they normally would, you've solved that issue. And that really is going to be a broad area, which would be philanthropy plus impact investing as one bucket. SRI, as in defined the old school SRI, which is screening out sectors, will remain, and I think is not going to either shrink dramatically or grow dramatically from where it is today. And that remains about broadly $1 trillion in the space, which means that the bigger chunk, of world equity markets, roughly 50 to 60 trillion, the big chunk left behind is really where the big growth potential is. So before we say that sustainability becomes mainstream, I think from our perspective, we think that big bucket needs to become, sustainability needs to become a significant player in that bucket. And for that, the main criteria is returns. We really think that at the end of the day, you have to document, demonstrate, and prove that these things enhance returns. Ironically, it's no different from what many mainstream financial variables were 40 years back. 40, 50 years back, people didn't take into account all the accounting variables. Or 15 years back, people didn't look at corporate governance before Enron happened. And we think in 10 years from now, all these variables, environmental, social, would be just part of normal analysis, where the whole term, sustainable investing, might be completely redundant, and we wouldn't have a panel like this. So our view is this information is valuable, enhances returns, and in 10 years would be moot.
I'd agree completely. The advent of sustainable investing will be on its ascendancy when there are more people understanding the impact on performance. And we're one of the newer ones to be in this field, and we've only been at it for 5.5 years. And normally you need a slightly longer trajectory to prove the business case for sustainable investing. We're doing everything we possibly can to prove that business case, but it'd be great to have an awful lot more investors alongside of us. I do think that, as we've seen, because our client base is all over the globe, for us, anyway, the Australians were the first to come in to this, and I think that sustainable investing is very much mainstream in Australia right now. Our clients then moved around the globe to Europe, which I think is, as Bryan said, way ahead of us here in the United States. But over the last 2 or 3 years, in the U.S., there's been broader appreciation and understanding. Perhaps the advent of many of these crises have helped to think that through, pushed by some of the pension funds. But it isn't mainstream in the U.S. I think it's going to take additional years of performance and understanding, but it absolutely will be in the short period of time. I'd say 5 years or slightly longer, because sustainable investing, you're really asking a question: you want to know more about these companies, or you want to know less? I think over time, this common sense analysis of what sustainable investing is will make it mainstream.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left from what I understand, and in fairness, your questions are really good, and we want to give really thorough answers, but I think we want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask their question. So if we could ourselves be brief as well. I think this young lady here has the question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mugdha, and I recently joined Grameen America. My question is to the entire panel. When we talk about socially responsible investing, one of the newer models that we see that has come up is social business, which is largely in Bangladesh right now, and Professor Yunus is leading that movement. I want to understand from you all, how sustainable do you think that model is in the long term? Thank you.
So I'll just briefly answer that. I think to me, the 3 things that really matter in change, let's say change the way we all want to see it, is returns, scalability, and actual social impact. That model really has a lot of potential in areas where scalability potential is high because the population is high. And I think in some regions it has a lot of promise, in others not so much.
I'll be very, very short. I had a quote from Tom Friedman, which I saw recently, that I think answers this. If you don't have scale in this revolution, it's just a hobby. If it's not sustainable, it won't last.
Thank you. Do you want to go back to this side and let this young lady with the red scarf?
I think I'm actually going to have to play the bad guy of the movie, because we do need to wrap it up in like maybe 5 minutes. So okay. I'm really sorry that we won't be able to answer all the questions. I wanted to ask you if you could just have a closing statement, and particularly, the title of the panel is From SRI to Sustainability, and we've heard how all of you, face different challenges, and from the questions how policy comes into place or your clients come into place and the investor needs. What do you see is the greatest challenge in your role to achieve sustainability, and for whatever you want to call it, for SRI or change or impact investing? And as well, please take a second to wrap up if you have any other thoughts that you want to share.
Would you mind if we each took 30 seconds, just so that, again, we can take more questions? If I'm going to make a closing statement, I would say one of the biggest challenges for us that we've experienced is education, just educating the public on what this is about, how to implement it, and how it can be successful.
Well, one of the big challenges is the terminology. I think there are too many terms, definitions, categories that are floating around, which is part of the education initiative. And the second really is the notion that it hurts returns. And I think that once we have a clear understanding of what this means and a better understanding of the implication on returns, we should be fine.
I guess in one sense, my closing remarks are a hopeful sign. We do believe that sustainable development will drive economic performance over the next 30 to 50 years. And that is going to be the entire term of your working life. You're going to experience this. We're moving from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. It's going to take a huge amount of money, a huge amount of time, and you're right smack in the middle of it. Now, it hasn't happened yet. Probably won't until we get a price on carbon. I don't know when that's going to be. It's going to happen. Could be 5 years, could be 3 years, could be 10 years, but it's going to happen in your lifetime. And the drivers of growth are going to be in this space, broadly defined. And I think from that perspective, it's incredibly exciting for all of you.
For us, it's going to be execution and accountability. Applying these principles to deals in a way that shows that they can enhance the financial performance of companies and setting that precedent for others in the industry to follow. And second, measuring the results so that when we go and talk to our investors, we can show them what we've done and begin to build a record that others can follow.
And I think if I had to pick one, I would just echo Peter. A big challenge is getting global regulatory policy around some of these issues like climate change so that we can really scale up investment.
Thank you. Pepe, are we able to take it? No more questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to thank our panelists and Pepe and Emily, and we'll be here if you want to ask any more questions.